All right, so this is the second of our videos, and this is time period 2. And so the same deal as last time, you're going to take notes, write down anything that I tell you, because I usually give you some pretty good SAQ hints. These SAQs should be on Saturday morning or Friday afternoon, depending on how we do it. I would prefer to do them Saturday morning, but I told the principal, I would work with you if you were offended by working on Saturdays. Just figured it'd be easiest for everybody. Anyway, period 2 overview. This is from roughly about 1648 to about 1815, basically the end of the 30 Years' War, all the way up to Napoleon. And somewhere along here, we seem to have missed the English Civil War, but we'll pick that up later. Anyway, the plan is, my rough overview is that what my rough plan is that Monday and Tuesday of this week, we're going to go over, time period 1. Wednesday and Thursday, we're going to go over time period 2. And then next week, Monday and Tuesday, we'll do time period 3. So by next Wednesday, we'll have had a big overview of the entire course. And then we're going to go back and get into significant detail. And by then, we should have some direction from the College Board about what these questions are going to look like. But anyway, go ahead and write this time period down. Just I may be off a year or two, but about 1648 to 1815. This unit is significantly harder than the first one because we've got constitutionalism, which is one of the hardest things I find to teach because you can just get bogged down in names and details. But here we go. So make sure you're paying attention. All right. And again, you can pause it right now and you can write down all this stuff and then come back as I go over it. All right, so you can pause it, and here I go. Anyway, with my description. Absolutism versus constitutionalism. We talked about this in the last unit. You're centralizing nation states. They're coming up, a lot of them, like France with capital in Paris, a centrally located capital. And then there's sovereignty. That's how much power the monarch has. In this country, we had popular sovereignty, where you were trying to give it more to the people. So you have sovereignty and you have the justification for that. The idea whether this is divine right or social contract. Those are major concepts right there, divine right versus social contract. And they'll probably both be on the your SAQs. Divine right is where the idea is God gives the king the right. God gives the king to write the rule, and then basically whatever the king does is God's will. That's the theory. Kind of like some people used to believe about the Pope. I'm sure some still do. Social contract is where you have a deal with the people, and the ruler rules by consent. And that's basically what we have in this country. We have these elections every so often, and our ruler rules by our consent. And yes, you can impeach him or whatever, but you can also vote for somebody different the next time around. Anyway, moving on, there's Louis XIV. There's the Fredericks. The Fredericks are over in Prussia. There's Peter the Great. We're going to go over all the big names. Maybe not in this lecture, but as time goes by. ECW, what the heck does that mean? ECW, I don't know. I should have, I guess, proofed this a little bit more. ECW, I don't know. I'll probably figure it out. There's the Dutch Republic. And remember, the two countries that are synonymous with constitutionalism are the Dutch and the English. And then there's the Polish monarchy we will talk a little bit about. Even though AP students are never supposed to discuss the exam with their teachers, one of my most brilliant students who got a 5, like he got on everything a few years ago, he's actually the guy who teaches in the room next to me, in the next hallway over, came back and said there were questions on the Polish monarchy. So this year we want to make sure we cover it. The old regime had tradition, hierarchy, and privilege. The nobles were at the top. There was like a hierarchy, okay? Like feudalism was a hierarchy. And the rich, this was all based on how much land they owned. And obviously, we're going to get to capitalism and socialism in Unit 3. And that is like, there's all this debate about socialism. But the most common definition of socialism is a philosophy that questions the philosophy of private property. But you can see right here where they're going to get that objection, because the rich are basically people who own the most land. The concept of group rights, no individual rights, peasants and serfs, how they were dependent on their landlords, how they were exploited, and how vulnerable they were. In the family-based economy, Then we're going to talk about the agricultural revolution, the innovations, the increased crop yields, less need for farm workers. And I think you know how this goes. We're going to be talking obviously about the enclosure movement and stuff like that and Jethro Tull. But as people move to the cities, as agriculture becomes more productive, you need less people. And so what they do is they move to the cities. And when they move to the cities, they become, they lose a lot of, the social things they were used to. And they just become just this big mob in the city. And they are going to work in these new factories that are being developed. There's the concept of cottage industry. Somebody's definitely probably going to get that on SAQ. Like I said, this is a very hard unit. But cottage industry is where you work in your home, in your cottage. And the best example of that were the sewers, the putting out system. I've also used the modern day example. I told you that a lot of people make hammocks here in the United States. And as you know, I have many, many hammocks. Eventually, I'm going to film a video in a hammock. They use that term in the hammock industry here in the United States. You have the big chains that make theirs in China, but then there's a lot of them that are made in people's home, and that's referred to as a cottage industry. Clearly, if this virus, all the effects of this virus continue, there will be a lot of people working for their homes, and if they're making stuff, it will be a cottage industry. There's the mechanization of labor. That's where they bring in machinery. Obviously, we're going to talk about that. And there's urbanization. That's the move to the cities. Obviously, if this virus was to continue like it is, you would see the opposite of urbanization, where you're going to have people, I don't know, is ruralization a word? You're going to be moving back to the country. As you know, I bought my property up in Taylor County. I'm sorry, Suwannee County. And there's very few, no one has died up there. There's only been a week. It's been a week since you had your first case up there. The county I grew up in, Holmes County, North Florida, finally has, after all this time, announced today, this is Tuesday, that they have one case of coronavirus up there. And so the rural areas, at least for a while, are safer. So pretty much like the Black Death, you may see the reverse of that. But what was going on in this time period was urbanization. People were moving to the cities. Okay, next slide. Mercantile empires, we talked about that in the last unit. Mercantilism obviously is a pretty big deal, where you try to have a favorable balance of trade. There's trade rivalries, slavery's brought in. Slavery is very obviously, the European powers are not going to have colonies, or at least not many, in Africa and other places like that, but they are going to have something similar to colonies. Eventually they will, with the scramble for Africa. And they're going to try to dominate, like the Portuguese and the Spanish, the slave trade as well, but as part of mercantilism or mercantilism. Here's the wars we'll be talking about. I will not be talking about the War of Jenkins' Ear, but it's got to be the most unique war that you've ever heard about. The War of the Austrian Succession. That's a pretty big deal. The 7 Years' War, which the Americans call the French and Indian War, which of course is the pivotal war that leads to the American Revolution. You've got the scientific revolution continuing in the Renaissance. That was the last time period. The Age of Reason. Now we're going to go into the Enlightenment. And it's going to affect the Age of Reason, religion, politics, economic, society. You now have a print culture where people are used to reading stuff in print. If you're, look at this picture right now, you're reading, but you're not using print. So I don't know what they call this. I know this is considered the information age that we're living in now, but as people move away from printed books and online, that's going to be the next evolution from print culture. And we're going to be talking about the enlightened despots. Russia, that's going to be Catherine the Great. Prussia, Frederick the Great. And Austria is going to be Joseph II. And some people throw Maria Theresa on that list, his mother. The French Revolution, we're going to look at the long versus the short-term causes. It's very liberal. Then it becomes radical and reactionary. And we're going to talk about AC/DC again. The failure of the Directory leads to Napoleon. There's going to be reforms. There's going to be wars of expansion. There's going to be failures. And then the fall of, I guess these, I don't know if this is hiding. Yeah, the fall of fall of the French Republic. Okay, moving on, we're on the next slide now. And again, you can pause it and write this down. Again, this is, pretty difficult stuff in my opinion. It's probably the hardest thing for me to teach. All right. With absolutism, the sovereignty is solely in the hands of the monarch. He's the absolute person. Now, remember, this is not going to be the same as totalitarianism, which is going to come later. Mercantilism, there we have that again, a very important topic. Taxation by decree. That's where simply, the government the king can just come along and just dictate how much you're going to pay in taxes. There are some representative bodies, but the king has power over that, the monarch. Limited representative bodies, church, nobles, universities, etc. There's war, and there's the key concept of a standing army, which I believe we talked about in the last lecture. That's where the king has an army that's permanently there. It's a professional army. Like we have our Navy SEALs, we have our Force Recon in the Marines, we have the Air Commandos in the Air Force, we have the super secret Delta Force. And there's going to be differences between absolutists in the East and absolutists in the West. France, there's one overwhelming example of absolutism as Louis XIV, the Sun King. And I probably told you before that the year my son took this exam, they had an essay where they had to discuss two different absolutists, and I hadn't really prepared my kids well enough that year because everybody knew to do Louis XIV. The big question was who was the other? And the best ones, I would tell you, if you get that essay, to talk about Peter the Great. Because obviously we spent a lot of time on Peter the Great. You've got lots of facts about him, and he was somewhat of an absolutist. And you're going to have them in Prussia, Austria, and Russia. There we go. It's those same three again. But those absolutists are going to be enlightened. Then you have constitutionalism. That's where you have sovereignty by the people. The people give the ruler the right to rule. You have limited government power, taxation by consent. The people have to consent to how much they're going to be taxed. And the representative bodies have the power of the purse. In our country, all spending bills must originate, I know a lot of you are in AP government, in the House of Representatives, not the US Senate, the House of Representatives. We're going to talk about the issues in Poland. We're going to talk about the Dutch, and we're going to talk about the United Kingdom, of course, in detail. But know these standards of absolutism and constitutionalism, because I might just say, hey, I might give you one of these and say, give me 4 or 5 facts about that in your SAQs and some examples. Here's the 3 big names you have to know. Probably you're going to get an SAQ on one of these people. Bossuet was a bishop. He's Bishop Bossuet. I have no idea how to pronounce his name, but he's a proponent of absolutism, but he says it's the divine right. And I'm fairly sure he worked with Louis XIV. He basically said, this comes from the Bible, and he would quote things from the Bible, and he would prop up the monarch. He would say, if you disobey what the king wants, you're disobeying God. Remember when I told you about Henry VIII's wife, Anne Boleyn, that just before they chopped her head off, remember they accused her of having sex with her brother, which is ridiculous. When they chopped her head off, she said, God save the king. And the reason she did that is she was worried about going to hell. And so she did not want to die with words on her mouth, dissing God's monarch, because she believed he was chosen by God. That is divine right absolutism. Then we go to Thomas Hobbes, majorly important. If you can stand it, you should go back and listen to the Ritchie song again. I know you don't like his voice and all that, but his lyrics are dead on. This is the idea that you should have a king because, less people are basically rude, selfish people. This is kind of what Alexander Hamilton would have said. Hobbes says, listen, people are evil. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. That's a quote there. And what you need to do is you need to have a king so he'll keep you safe. And then there's John Locke, who talked about the social contract, and he's who our U.S. government is based on. And he is the guy behind philosophical and biblical constitutionalism. I had not heard biblical before, but I had heard that he was, obviously, he's the guy, You know, we hope, you know, that Thomas Jefferson quoted in the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, we're going to pause here and we'll take this issue up again on the next video.